in this series that we're going to look at, we're going to spend 6 weeks looking at this idea of being in the image of God. We're all image bearers. We've talked about that before. We all represent someone or something based on a brand we're wearing, based on the amount of Dodger hats that are in the house. I see quite a few. That's awesome. Praise God for that. But what we also recognize in our image bearing are the things that we encounter throughout life in which we are using as a means of telling others a story about who we are. And so as we look at this idea of what it means to be made in the image of God, which comes from Genesis chapter 1, where God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness," we are seeing that through this lens of today, number one, being personal, having a personal spirituality. Next week, we're going to look at this relational perspective between our relationship to God and our relationship to others. We're going to look at the warfare of our spirituality, kind of the idea of Ephesians 6, putting on the whole armor of God, but also knowing that our war is not against each other. We're not fighting other human beings. We are fighting other much stronger people and persons, the devil, the prince, and the power of the air. And then week 4, look at the disciplines of our spirituality, fasting and praying, worship. We're going to look at silence and solitude. I'm not sure if you've heard that before. Actually taking a day of rest, known as a Sabbath. And then we're at our 5th week together at the corporate spirituality. What does it mean to be accountable to each other? What does it mean to encourage and to worship? And then the final one we're going to look at is our nurturing of our spirituality, the evangelism and the discipleship, which at the end of that sermon series in week 6, we're going to start our sign-ups for our small groups that we're going to start doing in homes in our community. And so that's just to give you kind of an outline of where we're headed from here on out. Just a few weeks ago, my wife and I and our extended family went up to Yosemite, a little trip. We were there for a couple days, and it forced us into no service, so we couldn't react to social media or text anyone, and all of our loved ones were with us, so it wasn't a means of needing any emergency phone calls or anything like that. But what we discovered when we were in Yosemite, which is something we try to do every summer, we found this creek, and the water level was a lot lower this time than usual, but what we found was this creek that someone had created that had a pretty good rapid to it. And so they had done to form these rocks, we're assuming. They weren't there when we were at the creek, but we saw that someone before us had gone and made this creek that actually made the rapid flow in a certain direction and at a certain speed. Now for me, because I am the devil I am and the thrill seeker that I am, I had to discover a faster way. Like this current has to be faster than what it currently is. And so my brother-in-law and I and my father-in-law, we start taking these rocks away, and we're like, well, if we move it this way, the current can start a little bit, we can give it a little dip, and it was really cool. And we spent literally like 6 hours at this creek just moving rocks all day. And my mother-in-law was like, you guys came to rest, and now here you are working. Like, what the heck, you know? And it's like, but you don't understand. Like, we're building a current. And so, of course, because of that too, we also had a raft that we brought with us, and we got all of their grandkids. I don't have any grandkids, but I have my own kids. And so we put all the kids on there. There were probably like 7 or 8 of them, and we put them all in the raft, and we send them down the current the first time, and it's kind of slow, it's moving, but it's not super rapid yet. And so they get stuck in a few places, and it's like, okay, we got to work on that part of the current over there. So then my brother-in-law and I go over there, and we start moving these rocks and everything else. And finally, 6 hours later, oh man, this rapid was flowing. You better believe this thing was moving. And so these kids are going down this rapid, probably 2 football fields worth of yards. And so we end up, at the very end of the current, they get out, they come walk the different trail, they come back to the same spot, and they keep doing this. And for 6 hours, kids are like, again, you throw one up in the air, and they're like, dude, my turn, again. And there's this idea that we had created this rapid that ultimately, yes, we wanted them to partake of it, but we also stood back and we looked like, look at what we did. Look at all the work we've done. This was amazing. And the kids loved it. And we asked them each time, like, what was your favorite part of our trip? And they said, the rapids. And of course, we take all pride in that, things like that. But what we realized, and of course, this was also a moment for me to reflect on what God was showing me through these things. And what happened was we recognized that our doing led to their being. They didn't worry about moving rocks. They didn't care about moving rocks. They were having fun on the raft. And for us, it was like, well, we created this thing for you, and we did all this work so that you could go down this raft. It was on the last day of our trip, and we woke up and we left, and we don't have that raft with us anymore. We don't have that current that we are on together, but it was our doing that led to their being. Our doing, this work of moving all these rocks, led to them just simply being the kids they are, enjoying the fun and the creation and things like that. And in that same way, our relationship to God is that He must be the one who does the doing so I can be the being. When it comes to our relationship with Christ, we need to come to terms with the reality that you and I cannot outwork God. And yet there are times in our Christian life where we feel as if we have to do all of these things to hopefully measure up to some sort of status before God. But we can never outperform, we can never outwork, we can never outdo, we can never overachieve what Christ Himself has done for us. And so in our efforts to serve God, most of us actually end up skimping out on our relationship to Him. We're in this perpetual state of hurry. You ever find yourself hurrying? Anyone in a hurry right now? Like, can this sermon wrap up? I got to go to brunch. I got to play 18 after. I got to get this thing done at home. I got this side project, whatever. We're all in this perpetual state of hurry, and we're battling to make the best use of every spare minute. We end our days exhausted from trying to meet the endless needs around us, and then our free time, air quotes, is filled with more demands in an already overburdened life. Some of us are actually addicted, not to drugs or alcohol, but to the adrenaline rush of doing. We might read about the need to rest and recharge, and we understand taking that Sabbath, and in a few weeks we will specifically talk about that, but we fear in that how many things might fall apart if I don't keep going. So we just keep going. And in this hurried and exhausted state, we have little time or energy left to invest in our relationship with God, with ourselves, and with others. As a result, our own lives remain largely unchanged, and the only thing we have to give away to those we lead is our shallow discipleship. And yet we see that the gospel is this: God did the work. Let's leave that to Him, and we get to enjoy what He has given to us. There's a reason God took a day of rest on that seventh day of creation, because you also need that one day as well. It wasn't just a way of God telling us, oh man, I'm so busy and I'm so strung out. Like, I don't know if did I create everything okay? Was everything put into the place that it should have been? He wasn't worried about that. It was a place of knowing and believing that His rest was a means of being able to enjoy the work that He had done. And so in the same way, you must also find for yourself and for your family a way to rest, a way to find a Sabbath, a way even for you personally to find that silence and solitude. And so this gospel that we have is not this means of behavior modification, but a moral transformation. What Christ was able to accomplish will always outperform what we try to muster up as what we would call self-confidence as we walk forward in following Jesus. And so we have this dichotomy of understanding, I understand the gospel is easy to respond to, right? If you just simply cry out to God, you will be saved. Anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. If you confess with your mouth, believe in your heart, you will be saved. There's a definitive moment in time where you come into relationship with Christ. But living out that reality is not as easy. It's not as simple as, we'll just follow Jesus and hope the rest of your life goes really well. There are other implications involved in that process. And so life itself, to take my earlier Yosemite analogy, is a difficult river to raft on. That's not even bringing up the disciplines and the discipleship that comes with following Jesus. Let's just look at life through this wide-angle lens. Because what we see from the moment we started growing up and learning and discovering life in front of us, we had these ideas of what we believed the perfect life to be. I don't know about you, but I never took any classes on how to be an adult. There was never a seminar like, hey, here's how to adult. And maybe there was, and I just forgot to sign up for it and pay the $150 fee or whatever. But there was this whole understanding growing up about these awards assemblies. You guys remember those? These awards assemblies for A+ student, outstanding performance, and most likely to succeed or whatever. I never got any of those. And I was really bummed out because I thought I worked so hard. What I ended up getting was an award called the Perfect Attendance Award. Now, see, perfect attendance was never anything I could have ever done to get perfect attendance. My mom dropped me off every day. So it's like, well, don't give me the award. I didn't do it. I had to. My mom kicked me out of the van and said, hey, have a good day at school. And she picked me up at the end of the day. And I got an award for perfect attendance. Like, where else was I going to go? There's a hall monitor and a security person making sure every kid isn't skipping out on school. And so I felt like I wasn't excelling in other ways that other people were until sports became that outlet for me. Whether it was t-ball as a 5-year-old and keeping score myself on the bench and like, yeah, we're winning. And coach was like, everyone's a winner. I'm like, no, you're not. Like, we're losing and we need to come back. I won those awards. It gave me a sense of direction in life. Like, oh, okay, I found my niche. I'm good at this. The awards that I wasn't getting in the classroom, I was getting on the court. And then as we continue to grow up, we get our driver's license. We learn to drive. We start paying insurance for that. Oh, I didn't know you needed insurance for a car. Well, how do you get insurance? Well, you got to call like 50 different companies, get a bunch of quotes, and see which one's the best one to sign up for. Okay, that's great. And then you also get a cell phone, and you pay that bill. And then you get a job. You sign up for a Roth IRA. You look at a building on your retirement funds. You get married. You recite vows. You have kids. You get an apartment. You get a house. You're paying that budgeting, all these things. It's like, how do I do all this? Just got to try to figure it out, I guess. And hopefully you have someone that you can look up to that did it before you, and then they tell you that they learned from someone before them. And there was nothing formal about doing life, and yet we've been thrown into this thing that says do life and do it well. And then we talk about this spiritual aspect of our life in saying don't just do life well, but do life well with other people. And it's like, I don't have time for other people, let alone myself. And so being a human being feels a lot more like a human doing. Because we're always doing, we're always finding side work and all these different things. And, oh, I want to create this Etsy account, and I want to do this thing on Instagram, and I'm going to start a band or whatever. Anyone else start a band? Come on, like when you're 5 years old, like, we're going to start a band. It's always catching up on bills, relationships, binge watching shows. It's all a game of cat and mouse, feeling like you're never caught up with what you're doing. And so when we look at this idea of getting through our day and living a life pleasing to God, it's no wonder we are more intrigued by being a human doing, because a task-list-oriented life seemingly has more achievement attached to it. And yet a person who practices being and doing operates from a place of emotional and spiritual fullness as you become deeply aware of yourself and of others and of God. And as a result, your being with God becomes sufficient enough to sustain your doing for God. In his book, Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, Pete Scazzero says healthy Christian disciples and leaders are those who consistently live from this emotional and spiritual fullness, and it impacts every aspect of their lives. Emotional fullness is manifested primarily by a high level of awareness of your feelings, of your weaknesses, and your limits, how your past impacts your present, and how others experience theirs. They have the capacity to enter into the feelings and perspectives of not just themselves, but of others. And they carry these maturities with them into everything they do. So as we see doing this life, being a human being, spiritual fullness reveals itself in a healthy balance between your doing for God and your being for God. They are careful not to engage in more activities than their spiritual, physical, and emotional reserves can handle. We don't say no to a ministry opportunity because it's a way of serving God. And yet at that same time, your capacity to do that ministry thing can only be done if you have first spent time with God. They receive from God more than they do for Him. They enjoy Jesus and they share that with others. It's about establishing a regular and sustainable rhythm that is achievable, that makes it possible to handle the demands and the pressures of life. It is someone whose cup with God is full, not empty, because you are consistently receiving the love of God He offers to you. And when your life begins to feel depleted, it is also recognizing the ability to pivot and to adjust your schedule. It's recognizing your presence with God. It's recognizing the presence with other people and with yourselves. And here in Luke chapter 10, Martha is a great example of a human being who is more like a human doing. Martha is actively serving Jesus, but the pressures and demands of her work distract her from God. She's scattered, uncentered, irritable, and anxious. Anyone else like Martha today? I'm getting there. While her hospitality is to be commended, her being with Jesus is not sufficient to sustain her doing for Jesus. Her spiritual life is imbalanced. Mary, on the other hand, sits at the feet of Jesus, listening to Him. She knows how to prioritize being with Jesus over doing for Jesus. And so this story of Mary and Martha demonstrates a vitally important truth, that the active life in the world for God can only properly flow from a deep inner life with God. The active life in the world for God can only properly flow from a deep inner life with God. So when this group had packed inside her house, Jesus was teaching and Martha was doing. It's historically given to us in this context. Jesus had just sent out 72 people to go and minister and to disperse around different regions that they were surrounded by and to go minister the gospel to different people, healing them, praying over them, speaking into their lives. And they're all coming back, and it's estimated that over 100 people were getting into Martha and Mary's house to listen to Jesus. Okay? So now put yourself in Martha's perspective as the host of 100 people in your house that probably can't fit in there, unless you've got a ginormous mansion somewhere. That's awesome. Praise God for that. But the whole point is that Martha is too busy being the host while Jesus is there teaching. She's asking, do you want some more coffee? Would you like some more of this? Oh, the bathroom's down the hall to the left. Like, she's doing all of this hosting so that others would feel welcomed in her own house. But listen to this. Martha didn't feel welcomed in her own home. Martha was distracted. What was meant as a form of listening and sitting at the feet of Jesus, Martha was distracted in her own house. And I wonder if that has been the case for you at times. I know it has for me. You're so distracted by what you're doing, especially when it comes to Sunday mornings. Because we don't have all week to be here and to set up, we're setting up on Sunday mornings. And it's this way of being so busy to do the doing. Like, did we set up the chairs right? Is the camera on? Is everything working? Are the lights going to flicker today? Is there a squirrel in here? We had 2 squirrels in here a couple weeks ago, and we had no idea where they were, so they had to get a pest control to come out and deal with that. That was great. The air stop's working, and we got to get the AC out here. Is the portable going to be ready? Is this going to be ready? Are we going to have this in time? And what we've discovered over these last few months is that none of that matters. Because what we have discovered is that God is growing His church and He's taking care of those details that don't even matter. We could sit on the floor for all we care. We wanted to live stream. We still can't live stream because the internet is so bad here. We're working on that. But we're trying to figure these things out. And the headache ahead of time is, well, why can't we live stream? Like, we have to be on YouTube. What if people don't hear the gospel? It's like, who cares? You're in a building with people where places they can't even meet in their own building yet. And so we have to look at what God is doing in our life. And so we can become so distracted with so much serving that we're missing out on what's happening right in front of us. Now, removed from the situation, here, it's tempting to be condescending. Like, gosh, dang it, Martha, what's wrong with you, woman? Like, come on, stop serving, just sit. Jesus is in your house, and you're too busy to listen to Him. But what about us? We put ourselves in Martha's place for a moment. How distracted would you be if 100 people crowded into your home? Add to this the high cultural value of their time. This Near Eastern culture had a level of hospitality so keen on the fear of disobeying God by dishonoring your guests. The way that you obeyed God, the way that you showed God to other people was by being the most gracious host in your own home. But then remembering that Jesus is in your home. He's the Messiah. He's the most important person in your nation's history, and in fact, human history. Would you be distracted by how your place looked? Or how would you feed this crowd? Or how many trips must be made to the grocery store because you don't have enough cookies for little, small group after fellowship time or whatever? I'm missing out on all these things. The thing's not cooking right or whatever. Martha is actively serving Jesus, but she's missing out on Jesus. Her life in this moment is defined by duty rather than delight. By the shoulds and the have-tos, by the pressures, by the distractions, but her commitment to her duty has disconnected her from her love to Jesus. In fact, Martha's problem goes well beyond just this momentary busyness. Her life itself is uncentered and fragmented. And I wonder that even if Martha had taken the time to sit at Jesus' feet, she would have still been distracted. You ever find yourself doing that? Knowing that you should be present in the moment, but still distracted by what's happening behind the scenes or around you or something like that. When my wife and I first started dating, it was when cell phones were just becoming a big thing. The iPhone was taken off, and we were dating, and we found ourselves sitting at a booth at a restaurant, scrolling on our phones, checking email, checking text messages, replying, well, I got to send this real quick because it's so important. My ministry is so important. I can't let this go for 30 minutes. And the one phrase that she said to me was, be here now. And I wonder how many of us need to be here now. We need to sit at the feet of Jesus without wondering, oh my gosh, what am I going to do for lunch today? Oh my gosh, we've got to get the school stuff ready. In the next few weeks, kids are going back, or we're going on vacation, and we've got all this checklist to do and things like that. I wonder if we are still distracted even when we sit at the feet of Jesus. Martha here, she's irritable, she's anxious, and yet one of the sure signs that her life is out of order is the fact that she even tells Jesus what to do. Lord, tell her to help me. Whoa. Easy there, Martha. And yet we're so quick to condemn Martha as the crazy one because she should just be sitting at the feet of Jesus. Isn't that what we should all be doing? But it seems to me that Martha isn't the strange person in this story because I think a lot of us relate more to Martha's situation than we do Mary's. What's remarkable is that Mary wasn't distracted. Now, see, we think as the human doing in this situation for Jesus, like, how lazy of a Christian can you be? Jesus is in your house, your bathroom's not clean, things are all messed up, people are stinky, they didn't wear their deodorant today, everyone's packed into this house, what's going on? And Mary's just like, nah, it's fine, whatever. Jesus is here. Like, she's so stoked out of her mind. And so Mary's not distracted. She ignored the insistent to-do list so she could listen to Jesus. And so Mary is active in a different way. She sits at the feet of Jesus. She's listening to him. She's focused on being with Jesus. She's enjoying communion with him, loving him. She's attentive. She's open. She's taking pleasure in his presence. She's engaged in a slowed down spirituality that prioritizes being with Jesus over doing for Jesus. Mary has one center of gravity, Jesus. And I suspect that if Mary had gotten up to help with the many household chores, she would not have been worried or upset by the same preparations that distracted her sister Martha. Why? Because she slowed down enough to focus on Jesus and to center her life on him. That was the better choice. And that irritated Martha. She's working like crazy while Mary just sits there. We all have that sibling who, when mom comes home from the grocery store and dad says, hey, go help with the groceries, there's that one sibling that just seems to be missing all the time, from helping out with the groceries. That wasn't me, it was my other brother. But you know who you are. She's working like crazy. Mary just sat there. Martha considered this either laziness or negligence. She's exhausted, and she finally says to Jesus in verse 40, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. And Jesus, at that moment, he didn't get up and start clapping for Martha like, Martha, Martha, I got to give it to you, girl. Props on serving. Look at those people taken care of. You are the host of all hosts. No, he actually rebukes her. In verses 41 and 42, Martha, 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 you anxious and troubled woman. You're so anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. To just about everyone else present, Martha's serving appears to flow from a gracious servant's heart. Thank you, Martha, for opening your house. Oh, the tea was wonderful. Thank you for the pastries and whatever else, whatever other else things women eat. They got their chicken salad or whatever it is, and their little crumpets or whatever. And so Jesus is discerning differently. He saw that Martha was serving out of anxiety, not adoration. She was serving because her doing was her identity. If she stopped doing, she stopped seeing her relationship with God in a way that's not okay. So out of anxiety, she's serving rather than out of adoration. What was making Martha so anxious? I'm sure all the wives and the moms in here are like, I can tell you. I made a whole list of the things that she's anxious about because you find yourself anxious about those things too. We know she was anxious about many things. It seems like Martha was anxious over how she pleased or impressed Jesus, how she impressed her guests. She was troubled at the thought that her home and her serving might reflect poorly on her and her entire family. And this anxiety blinded her to the one thing necessary that Jesus said, which was listening to Jesus. And she made many unnecessary tasks feel absolutely urgent. Well, if I don't do it, it won't get done. This kind of anxiety is very subtle. I don't know if you deal with anxiety. I know that just in the last few years, it's been something that I struggle with. But you know what anxiety always starts with? It always starts with the question of what if? What if? What if they don't like what I've served them? What if they don't want to come back to my house? What if Jesus gets up and leaves before I can even sit down? What if? You're creating these scenarios in your mind that don't even exist to hopefully find security and meaning. It has a selfish root, but its fruit looks deceptive and unselfish. It's the desire for approval dressed up to look like the desire to serve. It's my caring of what you think of me dressed up to look like my caring for you. It can be so subtle that we don't even see it clearly. It looks so much like the right thing that we believe it is the right thing. That's why Martha was confident that Jesus would agree with her over Mary. Mary cared more about what Jesus said than what others thought of her and her home. And because of this, Jesus commends her choice not to serve. Jonathan Bloom, in his commentary on Luke chapter 10, he says, Jesus' gentle rebuke of Martha was actually an act of love to her and to us. We are all Marthas at times. And through this correction, Jesus is asking us, whom are we serving in our serving? No one's motives are ever completely pure, but when we feel compelled to serve out of a self-conscious anxiety over what others think, it's likely we are serving our own glory and not Jesus' glory. And Jesus seeks to free us from this type of slavery by inviting us to stop working, to rest at his feet, and to listen to him. And maybe our response is, how is that possible? How can I possibly stop working? How can I possibly stop watching the kids before they make a mess or before they break something or before they whatever? How can I stop working? How can I rest? There's no time for rest. I got all these things I got to do. My boss is down my throat. My wife, my husband is down my throat. I don't know what to do. I'm feeling all worked up and anxious, so I need to find outlet for my anxiety, which means that through my anxious heart from feeling all the work I have to do in order to get rid of that anxiety, I have to go and work more. And your working more continues to separate the stopping of working and the beginning of resting at the feet and listening to Jesus. I wonder if more of our life will be less anxious when we are simply able to sit at the feet of Jesus. The myth that we have come to believe in is that our doing for God is that God needs me more than I need Him. Pete Scazzaro continues in his book, Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, work for God that is not nourished by a deep interior life with God will eventually deteriorate, and us with it. Over time, our sense of worth and validation gradually shift from a grounding in God's love to the success or the failure of our ministry, of our work, and our performance. And that's when the peace, the clarity, and the spaciousness of our life with Christ slowly, almost imperceptibly, disappears. Maybe this truth is piercing your flesh, and the gospel is finally being injected into your soul. That your doing is still not enough, that your doing, no matter how much doing you're doing, will still not be enough to please God. You can give glory to God in your work, but ultimately what we've discovered is that oftentimes our doing for God, quote unquote, is more so doing for ourselves. And to that I would say, welcome to the family of God. If this is piercing you and you're experiencing this gospel being injected into your life, it's because we understand that we need God more than God will ever need us. It hurts. The process is the detoxing of our heart and our soul. It hurts because He's not only chipping away at the sin you are entangled in, but He's also chipping away at the self-assurance and the self-sufficiency you've built yourself on. We look at all these different ways of practicing following Jesus, right? Whether you want to call it being a Christian or following Jesus or practicing the way of Jesus, whatever that looks like, we have these different topics that we want to hear on. Well, what does the Bible say about evangelism? What does the Bible say about discipleship, about missions? What does the Bible say about biblical manhood and womanhood? And then what we do is we find experts that we have found, and we want them to speak on the matter without really, truly being able to learn and to discover what God wants to show us in that. So if you want to talk on evangelism, you need to get that guy. He's the expert. If you want to talk on discipleship, she's the expert. You want to talk about missions, they're the expert. And we use these topics to determine the most important thing in our Christianity as they land on this pyramid scheme, but none of those things matter if we first do not recognize that there is a topic above every other topic, that there is the only topic by which our Christianity can be saved, and that is love. Why is that such a hard thing to fathom as the most important of all attributes related to a follower of Jesus? Oh man, you should hear his talk on evangelism. You should hear his talk on theology. This guy got his doctrine down. Oh, if you want to learn about tech in the church, you got to talk to this guy. It is amazing. Okay, that's great. How are they loving those around them? John 13:35 says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." Too often we find ourselves as the expert of a topic, but behind the scenes, we can't simply love. I love what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, because it shows us the true identity of what it means to do work for God, and it gives it its proper place in our life. 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong, a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. Even if I give away all I have, and even if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing." You see, the spiritual disciplines are centered on the love of God because that is where the power is. The power is not in how much you've read about evangelism. I don't care how many books you've read on discipleship. I don't care how many classes you went to in seminary. If you don't love, it doesn't mean a thing. He warned that great faith and great generosity and even great spiritual gifts without love are worth nothing. Why is it so hard to love? And even a greater question than that too, why is it so hard to be loved? Maybe for men, and maybe I'm just coming from my experiences culturally as a man, love seems weird. Love seems like a weakness. Love is too lovey-dovey or whatever. In other words, if those around us consistently experience us as unapproachable, cold, unsafe, defensive, rigid, judgmental, Scripture declares us spiritually immature. And the most radical expression of Jesus' teaching about love was also one of his most fundamental principles. Matthew 5:44 and 46, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Okay, it's easy to love the lovable. It's not easy to love the unlovable. For Jesus, enemies were not interruptions to his spiritual life or to his obedience to the Father, but often the very means by which we might experience deeper communion with God. What Jesus taught, and even greater, what Jesus modeled in his own life, was that our love for God is measured by the degree to which we love others. Look at all of Jesus' healings. It wasn't out of trying to spite the religious leaders. It was because he loved them. He simply loved them. You think about John, I think it's John chapter 6, maybe it's John 5, I don't remember. But in the Gospel of John, it's the man at the pool at Bethsaida. He's paralyzed. He's been paralyzed his entire life. And Jesus goes to him on the Sabbath, which the religious leaders said, you can't heal on the Sabbath, which isn't that ironic because God had made the Sabbath as a day of rest, and it was a day where you can enjoy and experience the love of God. They made the Sabbath a doing, stopping, because the doing and the stopping needed to stop because they were doing too much doing all week. But then Jesus reminds them, wasn't the Sabbath made for man? Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. And so Jesus approaches this paralytic and he says, get up, take your mat, and walk. And it wasn't because he was like, hey, did you see what I did? Hey, religious leaders, I'm over here. Woo-hoo. He was saying this because out of love, he wanted to see this man walk. And so the only way in which these other things, the power in evangelism, the power in discipleship, the power in missions, can all be accomplished are all fueled by an understanding of the love of God. As we wrap up Ephesians 3, Paul talks about this idea of the doing and the being. He says in verses 14 through 19, for this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. If someone believed that people were motivated for right living through threats, then a healthy spiritual life would be spent dwelling on the threats and on the fear of those threats, thinking of all the worst case scenarios, and coming up with a plan to save the world. If someone believed that people were motivated for right living through love, then a healthy spiritual life would be spent dwelling on the love of God and not just the Sunday school version of John 3:16, which means I know it in my heart, but I don't know how to live it out. It would look like an ongoing, joyful pursuit to sit and meditate on the love of God, to memorize the love of God, to pray for understanding of the love of God, and to even become a resource of the outpouring of God's love. In another letter to a different church, Paul says in Galatians 1:13 through 16, for you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and how I tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age, among my own people, and I was extremely zealous for the tradition of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult any human being. And so Paul talks about all that he had obtained through good works, and yet what was his response? All that he obtained got him nowhere. And then he talks about what God did, and if you notice, the subjects of the sentences change as to who is doing the doing. The verb changes when it talks about he who set me apart. He was pleased to reveal his Son to me. On the flip side, Paul said, I did all these things in Judaism. I persecuted the church. I did this. I was zealous. All these verbs end up changing because his life was transformed by God's doing and not his own. Everything changed when God did the doing instead of Paul doing the doing. There is no status to obtain through the gospel except what has been given to us, John 1, being a child of God, a child of light. A child doesn't have to do anything to obtain or to keep their status of child to their parents. Your kids don't have to wonder if they belong to your family because they have your name. They have your blessings. They have your roof. They have your money. They have your money. Did you know that? They have your money. All that eating out, all those clothes that they're growing out of, all the pants that they're growing out of, which I've noticed is more in guys than in girls. Even when I was growing up, it was like my parents were buying me new pants every week. So if you've got boys growing, they're going to keep growing and you're going to keep buying more pants. But then you can have more kids and then, they can inherit whatever. Only the gospel can grow your understanding of the love of God. Because when we focus on the perfection and the death and the resurrection of Christ, we find life-changing love. This gospel teaches that God never intended for us to become someone capable of carrying the world on our shoulders like we project on other people. Oh, well, that pastor must be able to do that, and only he can do that because it's so important that only he can do it. Or this side job, I can't ask anyone else to come and help me because I've got to be the one to do the job. God did not design Adam and Eve to do all the work so God could sit back and rest. God placed them in a position where everything they had and continued to have came from him. Neither did God put Adam and Eve in the garden to sit around and do nothing. God often assigns work as a sign of relationship and as a gift out of his love. And so God created work before sin entered the world in our hearts, not allowing a genuine relationship and total honesty about following Jesus, however, will create in us a spiritual careful. And so I'm going to wrap up with this. You can be a gifted speaker for God in public, but you can be a detached spouse or an angry parent at home. You can function as a leader and yet at the same time be unteachable, insecure, and defensive. You can quote the Bible with ease and still be unaware of your transformation. You can fast, you can pray, you can be in small group and yet remain critical of others, justifying your actions as one who has the gift of discernment. You can lead people to God when in reality your primary motive is an unhealthy need to be admired by others. You can be hurt by the unkind comment of a coworker and justify saying nothing because you want to avoid making peace. You can serve tirelessly in multiple ministries and yet carry resentments because there is a little personal time for healthy self-care. You can lead a large ministry with little transparency, rarely sharing about your struggles or your weaknesses. The reason there is this separation is because we've tried to separate our life at home and our life at church. Our life with others and our life with God have been separate for so long that we treat each one of them differently. That we say, well, I have these things I need to project onto my family, onto my kids, onto my coworkers, onto my boss, onto my neighbors. But then I need to do these things for God. And we disconnect and we unmarry, we divorce this reality that what we do to others is ultimately a reflection of who we are in Christ. And so we cannot unmarry what we do for others or how we treat others, because how we treat others and what we do to others is a projection to them of the God we serve. What God do you serve? Do you serve a God who allows you to get away with things at home while lifting your hands up at church? Do you worship a God who will not take into account the sin that is hidden and secret from everyone else while you lead a small group or you lead a prayer group or whatever that might be? You see, these are all examples of spiritual immaturity, and yet we can remain detached from its poisonous roots because we don't think that any of this could happen to me, yet you may be so unaware of it that it's already there. And so as we look at this idea of being versus doing, the doing is this task-oriented way of trying to please God, as if what I've done is good enough for him to say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Because the only way that we can actually be that good and faithful servant is when we can respond to God's question, what did you do with my son? The spiritual being, a state of being willing to sense the Spirit of God working in your life as you spend time with him. Not doing your devotion, hoping that God will finally answer that prayer request you've been praying for so long, or to read it to project what you want it to say to you, but that you would simply just say, Lord, not what do you have for me, but Lord, who are you creating me to become? Stop asking that question about, Lord, what do you have for me? Because God has a lot for you. God has more for you than you're even asking him to give to you right now. Don't ask God what he has for you, because he has a lot. Rather, ask the question, Lord, who are you creating me to be? Are you distracted by trying to produce something for God, like Martha? Or are you delighting in his presence, like Mary? He's not asking you to become a product, to sell God to other people. We're not religious salespersons. We are children of God. My children do not have to sell their belonging to me to convince me that they are mine. They don't have to tell other people, well, I belong to that person over there. Well, how do I? Well, I have my dad's last name. I live at this house and this address and, stranger danger and that whole thing. It's like our kids don't need to project to other people and to try to convince them away that we belong somewhere. They've inherited my name. They inherit my house. They've inherited my sins, but they also inherit God's blessings. So rather than being a product for God, trust the process God has you going through. You might be confused, like, how do I be rather than do? You got to ask God that question. I've given you what you need, and now you need to go and find a way to ask God, not what do you have for me, because he's got a lot for you, but what or who are you creating me to become? Because in that process, you will discover what it means to be a human being, because God has done all the work, he's done all the doing, and you get to be the being. Just like I created that rapid for my kids, and that fun and that joy that they had in that presence, the Bible says that in the presence of God, there's fullness of joy. Let God do that work, and you get to reap his blessing as he gives it to you freely as you trust his Son. Would you pray with me?